I want to start this webinar, today's webinar. This is the second in the series of the Early Career Researcher webinar that IWMI India office has been organizing since last month. And I would want to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Balsher Singh Sidhu. Balsher, if you would like to switch on your video, please. Yeah. Thank you, Balsher, for joining us today. So Dr. Balsher is going to talk about the impact of climate change on India's agriculture, particularly look at the impact of climate change on the crop yield of various crops. Balsher is a brief introduction and he will make an extremely interesting presentation that I think is very useful for the work all of us do in terms of water, food, and agriculture. So Dr. Balsher Singh Sidhu is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Resources, Environment and Sustainability at University of British Columbia, Vancouver. His research interest lies at the intersection of climate change, food systems, and sustainable resource use. He uses advanced statistical and machine learning methods to understand the relationship between climate change and agriculture. His doctoral research was funded by a 1-year Canada graduate scholarship, wherein he developed crop yield models for various crops in India to predict yields till 2100 under multiple emission scenarios. He is currently analyzing land use-based strategies for mitigating climate change. Dr. Sidhu was also a contributing author to the water chapter in the 6th IPCC assessment report of the Working Group 2. And he has also worked as a short-term consultant for the World Bank on the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals 2020. Previously, he held undergraduate and master's degrees in civil engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and the University of Toronto, respectively. So I now invite Dr. Sidhu to start his presentation. This, I think, is a particularly apt presentation today. Our last month's presentation by Ariana Tozzi, who was a PhD candidate in a UK university, she talked about the historical antecedents of some of our water management challenges, how the colonial decisions taken then affected the way we manage water, and she used the example of Maharashtra. And today, I think, is very apt that Dr. Sidhu is going to talk about what climate change is doing and is going to do to Indian agriculture in the future. So over to you, Dr. Sidhu. You will have around maybe 35 minutes or so, and then there would be questions. In the meanwhile, I would request all of you who are not from IWMI to please introduce yourself on our chat box. Please provide your questions in the question and answer session, and at the end of it, Dr. Sidhu will answer to your questions. Thank you, and over to you, Balsher.
Thank you, Aditi. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you. I'll just share my screen and then can you see my title page?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just briefly describe so I completed my PhD last year in November 2021, and I briefly describe the work that I did during my PhD and how that ties into the current understanding of climate and agriculture, not just in India, but across the world. Yeah. So to briefly describe my academic journey, I grew up in Punjab. For those who are not familiar with Indian geography, this is a small state in Northwest India. It's sometimes also called the breadbasket of India. This was the part of the country where the Green Revolution started in the early 60s, and from where the whole increase in agricultural output program started. I completed my undergraduate studies in civil engineering from IIT Delhi, and over there I dabbled with various projects related to environmental sciences, including air pollution modeling and water treatment. I did my master's from University of Toronto, where my research focused on water treatment processes, especially for drinking water. But I always wanted to come back to the field of agriculture and efficient resource management. So I came to University of British Columbia for my PhD, where I did my research on Indian agriculture. And So this image over here, it aptly describes the motivation for doing what I do. Most of you would probably recognize what this is. It's a groundwater pumping well. It's used to irrigate fields for growing different crops. Over here, this particular photo shows paddy in the background and the tubal in the foreground. And it's from a photo from Punjab, which has 1.5 million of these today. And they're just everywhere. When I was growing up, when I was a child, I heard people talking about the limited groundwater reserves that are being depleted at a very rapid pace in this part of the country for growing rice using groundwater. So that piqued my interest, and I decided to look at this connection further between agriculture and water and climate and climatic variability. So although I was trained as a civil engineer, my interest gradually shifted towards agriculture and land use. So I believe we all are on the same page in terms of climate change happening, being caused by human beings, and agriculture being sensitive to weather and climate. There have been a lot of research which has shown that the increase in global temperatures have impacted agriculture. And it's not just the long-term pattern or the average temperatures over the growing season. Even sub-seasonal variability is important, and it impacts our agricultural productivity. For example, if there's a drought in the earlier stages of crop growth followed by excessive rainfall during harvest, overall, it may seem like the season was normal in terms of the amount of rainfall that was received. But because of this sub-seasonal variability, the crops may suffer, or even the farmers may even see total crop losses. So this was a motivation for me. I wanted to expand and explore this further in terms of what exactly is the mechanism through which climate variability affects crop yields. And the reason I chose India is because, of course, I come from India, and so I've had familiarity with this, with the country. But also, agriculture employs over 40% of the national workforce in the country, and on top of that, it also has important global implications because India is a big agricultural producer. For example, we grow 70% of the world's chickpeas, 1/3 of the world's millets, and 1/4 of the world's rice. So anything that impacts Indian agriculture has big ramifications for global food security. And a lot of Indian agriculture is rain-fed. Almost half of the net sown area is rain-fed, and it's extremely sensitive to climatic variability, even more than irrigated, which is, of course, expected because rain-fed is more at mercy of climatic variability. And when I say climatic variability, I mean both short-term variability in terms of more rains or heat waves, and also long-term climate change that is occurring and is expected to continue to occur in the next few decades. So to study this variability or this relationship between crop yields and climate, we build crop yield models, and there are a variety of crop yield models in use out there which can be used to find the functional relationship between crop yields and climate. So I wanted to investigate the value of these statistical models, which are a subset. I'll go into more detail about this in the next few slides. So I wanted to use statistical models for predicting Indian crop yields under a changing climate scenario. So essentially, we have 4 major modeling approaches that climate scientists and food scientists use. So one is farm level crop models. So where you collect data from a farm in terms of you collect some weather data, you collect crop yield data, and then you try to understand how they relate to each other. There are global physiology-based models which use plant physiology and plant the mechanisms that go on when a plant grows and develops. So those mechanisms they are used to build models which can predict crop yields as a function of climate. Statistical models are another popular approach. So what they do is they essentially pick up historical climate data, historical crop yield data, and then they try to fit a relationship between the two. So this is the interest. This was the topic of my PhD, and we'll go into more detail about these. And less popular, but still used in some places, are soil warming experiments, where you can actually tweak the local climate or the local conditions that a plant is exposed to. And then depending on how the plant responds to it, you can build a model. So essentially, what we are trying to do is we are trying to find that function which relates climate to crop yields. That's our whole motive behind doing what we do. So the statistical models that I used, they use data which is collected over space and time. So we have data for different parts of the country collected for multiple years, both for climate and crop yields. And then we try to use different statistical techniques to relate these to each other. These are often called panel models. So in case you hear this term, it essentially means data collected over time and space, and relationships extracted from that. And then we have different metrics to measure model performance. I won't go into the details because that's beside the point over here, but just know that these are techniques through which we can see which model performs better than the rest. For example, you could have a model which has a lower RMSE or root mean squared error, which it means that the model is able to extract or is able to extract the relationship and predict for unknown data better than the others. So a lower RMSE means the model is performing better. And that's just one example. There are a multitude of other metrics which can be used. So with that quick theory out of the way, I'll focus on what I did for my PhD. I was interested in two dimensions in terms of these models. So what kind of climate variables to include in them, and what technique should we use to build those models? So you could have, there are so many different variables, so many different techniques to choose from. And I wanted to see how those choices affect the model performance. And using those, the results from those two analyses, I wanted to see what the future crop yields in India will be under changing climate. So today, for want of time, I will only focus on the third aspect of my research, which is more the applied form of it, so not the theory. Okay, so the data and methods that I use. So I used publicly available data for all my analysis. The crop yield data was acquired from the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. They have district level data for multiple crops across the country from 1966 to till a few years ago. And I used climate data from the Indian Meteorological Department, historical data, and then I related those two to build my models. I also used future climate data in order to predict future crop yields. CMIP6, this is a coupled model intercomparison project, which is, it gives you the expected climate in going into the future under different climate change scenarios. So depending on what kind of emissions we have, what kind of mitigation efforts humanity makes, there are different scenarios, and then I used four different scenarios for my analysis. So yeah, as I discussed earlier, there are multiple variables, multiple ways that climate can affect crop yield. So it could be just changing the mean seasonal temperature, which is shown at the bottom. So the average temperature of the season could go up by half a degree, and that would impact crop yields. And at a more subseasonal level, there could be changes in the number of rain days, or the number of days that plant experiences water stress, or the number of growing degree days, which is a metric of how intense the heat exposure for a plant is. So it's not just about the average changes in climate, it's also about the inter or the subseasonal variation in weather, which is important. So I used a multitude of variables in my analysis. And at the same time, when we build a model, we make a lot of assumptions about what the functional form will be. So we could say that every 1 degree rise in temperature has the same impact on crop yields, which is a simple way of saying that the response to temperature between the crops response to temperature is linear. Or we could have more elaborate and more flexible forms of models using machine learning, where the functions are more complex than just simple linear regression. So I won't discuss the inner mechanisms of these techniques, but this is just to say that there are different functional forms that you can fit to the same data to develop models. And I also explored that in terms of if we make the model more complex, does it improve its prediction for future crop yields? So, okay, yeah. So we found that on average, the subseasonal variables may not matter as much. It may seem like they don't matter as much, but whenever there is some anomalous behavior, anomalous weather behavior, for example, when there's a drought or when there's excessive heat events in a certain year, which happened in 2002 and 2009 in our data, the subseasonal variables become extremely important. So this is just to say that the models which don't account for subseasonal variability may be missing out on the actual impact of climate on crop yield. So we do need more research, and we do need to be more mindful of this sort of subseasonal behavior, which gets flooded out if you only use seasonal variables, which is still popular in the field because sometimes there's not enough data. And India, fortunately, has a lot of high quality data, so we were able to do this analysis. And at the same time, this is just, I won't discuss the equation, but this just shows that the models have different philosophies behind them. A linear regression assumes that there's a linear relationship between the variables, whereas a machine learning model like a boosted regression tree, it fits a more flexible form to the data. And by flexible, I mean that it's able to, sorry. Okay, what happened there? Yeah, so by flexible, I mean that it's able to pick up those nuanced relationships that a simpler model may not be able to. For example, over here, the machine learning model is shown in purple over here. So it's able to understand that to a certain extent, temperature doesn't really affect crop yields. This is for pearl millets. But when it crosses a certain threshold, the crop yields start going down. So this is more, this gives us more information than a simple linear model, which just says that every degree Celsius rise in temperature has the same impact on crop yields. Of course, there are ways to include those sort of sophistications in a linear regression as well. But there are some limitations to that, which of course I can discuss more in the question answer round. But this is just to say that machine learning models or more flexible approaches do offer some additional benefits to our modeling. Okay, so we know that subseasonal climate variables are important. We know that some more flexible forms are important. What does it, how does it help us in predicting future crop yields? So we picked up, we used some future climate data from CMIP6, the latest version of the future climate projections from CMIP. And we see that, as expected, temperatures are rising. But more than that, we see that the nights are warming faster than days. So the diurnal temperature range, or the temperature difference between days and nights, is getting shorter. So nights are getting warmer. Both days and nights are warming, but nights are getting warmer faster. And this has been shown to reduce rice yields because of physiological processes that affect the development of the rice grain. We also saw that although temperature rises by a couple of degrees, for example, the increase in the extreme heat exposure for the Rabi season, which is when wheat is grown in large parts of India, the exposure to extreme heat exhibits up to a 63% increase with every 1 degree Celsius rise in mean temperature. So this is just the way that the impact on crops is amplified as temperature rises, as for every 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. And this can be extremely critical for crops with temperature thresholds during various growth stages. For example, the upper threshold for wheat's flowering stage has been reported to be 31 degrees Celsius, and any excess heat during that stage can lower yields. And as the temperature rises, as climate changes, most parts of India are expected to see more rainfall. Just doing a time check. Yeah, so we expect the monsoons to get wetter all across the country, and even the winter precipitation is expected to increase, except some parts in eastern India. So this again, of course, has implications for all the crops that we grow in the country. And similar patterns are observed for soil moisture. So precipitation is the dominant factor which decides or which determines the soil moisture in the future. So when we input all these future climates into our model, we found that nationally averaged, we expect crop yield losses of 3, 4, 5%, depending on different crops. So we analyzed 3 crops: rice, wheat, and pearl millets. And this is just by 2050 and under a moderate scenario, SSP2. So under a more extreme scenario, a more extreme emission scenario like SSP 4 or 5, the crop yield losses will be even higher. And if we are talking about the long term, by 2100, it will be even higher. So this is just in the next 20 to 30 years, under a moderate emission scenario, we expect that crop yields would be lower by 3, 4, 5% compared to a no climate change scenario. We also see that because of the inherent variability of climate and the fact that we can't predict it with 100% accuracy, there is high variation in yield predictions because of the variation in the climate models. So we used multiple climate models, and each of them have different climate predictions, and depending on that, our yield predictions are also varying. So yield decreases are predicted for all cases in our analysis, except the soil moisture model for pearl millets, which is shown in blue over here. But overall, we expect that yields would suffer because of climate change. And as expected, under a higher emission scenario, these losses will be even higher. So over here, we are just discussing the nationally averaged crop yield losses. However, there is a high spatial variation. So within the country, the yield losses are different in different parts of the country. So over here, I have shown the yield loss, the percent yield loss expected under different emission scenarios coded by color, and going from top to bottom are different statistical techniques. So the top is the simpler linear regression, the bottom is machine learning, the boosted regression trees. And going from left to right are different climate variables. So this is just throwing all my model results in one figure. So although it looks a bit cluttered, just understand that these are different assumptions that I made about what climate variables are important and what statistical technique makes most sense. So depending on those choices, we see these humps over here. And these humps, they show the distribution of crop yield losses across different parts of the country. So some parts may see yield gain, but some parts may also see huge yield losses. For example, this red hump or on the extreme bottom right of the plot. And that is problematic. Why? Because over here, I'm just discussing pearl millets as an example. That is the part of the country which is the biggest, which accounts for a big chunk of pearl millet production. That is the state of Rajasthan. So Rajasthan will, because it's already, it's comparatively hotter than compared to other parts of the country, it's comparatively drier. The pearl millet over there is highly susceptible to climate change, and some parts of the state may see crop losses or yield losses of up to 15 to 20%. And this is again for a moderate emission scenario by 2050. For a high emission scenario by 2100, this is even higher. We expect high yield losses. So all this is good. So what we started with is a problem that climate change impacts crop yields, and we diagnosed, or we came up with some numbers on what sort of losses we expect in the future. I also wanted to discuss some use cases of these models. So once we know what is the most sensitive crop, or what's the most sensitive region to climate change, we can start thinking of ways to reduce that vulnerability. One example is irrigation, of course, because irrigation helps not just against water scarcity, but in some cases it can also help against extreme heat events. So the results from our models, they can be used for designing interventions. They can be used for designing interventions at a local scale. They can be used for designing interventions at a national scale. For example, there were some parts of Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan which were extremely vulnerable, where pearl millet yields were extremely vulnerable to climate change. So we ran a simulation of our models with more irrigation availability to the farmers. So what we told the model is simply to increase the amount of irrigation that is available to the farmers, and we saw that in some districts, this irrigation access could reduce yield losses by up to 30%. So whereas previously we were expecting a 30% yield loss, now that may come down to 20% compared to a no climate change scenario. So even though it doesn't totally remove the impact of climate change, but irrigation expansion can certainly help with reducing the vulnerability. All of this, of course, has to be considered within the realm of availability of water, which is extremely critical, especially in this part of the country. There's not enough water for sure to expand irrigation to all farmers. So maybe there's some targeted interventions that can be done in terms of finding the most vulnerable people, most vulnerable crops, and then targeting them to get the most bang for the buck, so to say. So that is a quick analysis or a quick summary of what I did for my PhD. There are, of course, a lot of improvements that can be done, and I'm currently working on them. There were a lot of assumptions that I made about crop choices and growing season length, which can bias the results. And of course, I did a national level analysis, but India is a large country and national studies can ignore some very important regional patterns. So using these models at a more local scale and assessing regional vulnerability to climate change can be of value. And I just use statistical models, but there, if you remember, we discussed there were multiple other theories or techniques to do that. So maybe models which can use more, which can be based on crop physiology can also help in improving our predictions. I also wanted to take a couple of minutes to discuss another use case of my models. So till now, I had only talked about future climate change till 2050, 2100, but equally important for farmers, for policymakers, for NGOs, for everyone is end of season yield forecasts. So we want to know if there's a certain climate event, if there's a heat wave, if there's a drought, if there's flood, what kind of impact will it have on crop yields expected at the end of the season, right? So maybe a lot of you know that in March there was a big heat wave in North India. That is the time of the year when wheat crop is developing. And over here I have shown temperature anomalies, or anomaly is just a fancy term for saying the deviation from expected temperature for the growth stages 3 and 4 of wheat. So I defined using FAO statistics, I defined 4 growth stages of wheat, and the growth stages 3 and 4 overlapped with that heat wave in March. So I calculated the temperature anomalies during those 2 growth stages. And we see that, especially during the 4th growth stage, which is shown on the right, the temperature anomalies were as high as 5 to 6 degrees Celsius in some parts of the country, especially parts of Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan. So this is when wheat harvest was happening, and this extreme heat event reduced crop yields, or at least is expected to have reduced wheat yields. So the use case of the work like mine is that these can be used to understand or to predict crop yields even before the actual harvest has taken place. So for example, my models, when run using this heat wave data, they predict that almost all these areas of the country. So this is the wheat growing part of the country, and they account for almost 90% of the country's wheat production. Some districts in this area could have witnessed wheat yield losses of up to 5 to 10%. So the x-axis over here is divided by is separated into different crops over here, and the size of the circles show the amount of area that is where wheat is grown in a certain district. So all of these 5 states that grow wheat, they are expected to have suffered wheat yield losses. We don't actually have actual data on how much yield production actually took place. And the latest estimates from the government are 3 to 4% yield losses, which is close to my estimate of 4 to 5%. So we'll know more as the actual data comes out, which is usually it happens at the end of the year or the start of the next year. But this is all to say that these models, they can be used for making predictions, timely predictions, which can then be used for coming up with interventions for supporting farmers in distress. Time is of the essence when these sort of calamities take place. There was some parts of the country did not have enough rainfall during the monsoon this year, and that is when the rice cultivation is taking place. I am currently doing that analysis. So even though the rice season is still ongoing, using some weather predictions for the next few months, we can actually get some estimates on what kind of yields we should expect when rice is harvested. And my preliminary results, which I'm not showing today, they do there is some evidence that rice yields will suffer because of the less than normal rainfall that has occurred in northeast or in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh and Bihar and Jharkhand. Okay, with that, I would like to just quickly wrap up my presentation because I want to give more time for questions. My work was supported by a Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship and a 4-year doctoral fellowship from UBC. And I'm thankful to my supervisors, Naveen, Melinda, and Mark. And yeah, I'm open for questions. And this is my email if you want to get in touch. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sidhu. That was a fascinating presentation. While we were doing this IPCC chapter, these are the kind of numbers that we were getting, but numbers for India I didn't think they were as frequent as we were getting from other regions. So I think that's a real good addition to the literature, and as you show, of also much practical value. I'm certainly looking forward to your study on impact of the current delayed monsoon on rice production. We have seen in the field that farmers without access to irrigation haven't actually planted rice. And, again, anecdotally, we have heard that still early August in Bangladesh, almost 25% of the area was kept fallow. So I think these is absolutely very important points. The other part was also about irrigation, reducing some of these, mitigating some of, I mean, helping reduce some of these losses. But the overall point is, where will that water come from? I think that's also an important research question that we need to look into. With that, I wanted to open the room for questions, and I see a couple that have been written on the, my colleague Deepak has a question that he has typed on the chat, and I think I have a way of asking them to actually speak. Okay, Deepak, you can ask your question. I think you now have you are now, yeah.
Right, so hi Balsher, right, so many thanks and congratulations for the wonderful presentation. Right, so I have a clarification question. Right, so do we account for the change in the development of the climate sensitive technologies over this period? Right, so how do you account them? Right, so for instance, you are just forecasting the yield, right, so the impact on yield for the next 20 to 25 years. So I'm just trying to understand how we account at the same, right, so during the same period, right, if we see an improvement in the climate sensitive technologies, right, like wheat or paddy, wheat varieties and other climate sensitive technologies, how do we accounting in your analysis that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deepak. That is a great question, and that is always a point of concern with these models, which are based on historical data. So what we do is, these models, they account for any changes that have occurred in the past. So we do have variables which account for non-climatic changes in crop yields. So if there's been a better variety in the past, that is accounted for in the model. However, it's not easy to predict these sort of interventions or disruptions in the future. So for example, if 10 years from now, there is a wheat variety which is absolutely immune to heat waves, this model won't be able to account for that, because we never saw that in the past. So these models are based on relationships that we've seen in the past, and then we try to extrapolate them into the future. So that is a big weakness of any sort of modeling analysis, because your analysis can only draw on relationships that you have already seen and not account for stuff that could happen in the future. But yeah, that's a great question. So that is one limitation of these analysis. But we do account for all other non-climatic determinants of crop yield, like automation or better access to farmer, but better access to markets or better road infrastructure. So all of those things are accounted for in these models. Yeah.
And right, so since I'm just talking about this, maybe right, so you have checked it. Right, so have you tried taking a variable called right, so the investment in agriculture, right, so in the technological R&D, right, so at the India level, right, so for that kind of investment on the year-on-year basis, right? So since you are coming from the past period, if we can include that and how it will change my result. Right? So that's a more direct variable in terms of including the trends and patterns in the investment in technological R&D.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people do. They do account for variables, including R&D. I didn't include it, but I included it indirectly. So I had time trends and I had geographical trends in my models. So all those non-climatic determinants like soil quality or automation or better yield, better varieties, all of those things are accounted for using a time and geography variable in my models.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thanks, Deepak. Thanks, Balsher. Can I now invite Oshishman to ask his question, please, followed by Sunipa. Sunipa, I've raised your hand. Yeah.
Hi, Balsher. Thanks for a great presentation. So I have two questions. One is, can you speak a bit more on the benefits of the ML model? Because you, in your presentation also, you said that some of the non-linearities can be tackled within OLS. So can you just say what other benefits the ML models have? And my second question is to some extent related to what Deepak said. So even ignoring the adaptation in future that might happen on new technologies, my question is, and here I may have misunderstood how you're doing it, but if you are using historical data on these climatic variables, in future, if these climatic variables go out of sample, then is there a chance of out of sample predictions and without knowing how the relationship will be in that range? So yeah, these are my two questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. They are they're very they're great questions. Yeah, so the benefits of ML over OLS, just to not spend too much time on it, but non-linearity for one. But there's also the fact that when for example in OLS, there's a lot of assumptions apart from the linearity or the non-linearity of those relationship. For example, there are assumptions that the relationship is the same throughout the country. So in different parts of the country, temperature has the same impact on crop yields. You could again include variables to make it more flexible, but then again you're making assumptions and you have to you're changing the model even before the model has run. So you need some a priori assumptions about the model, about the functional form. But with ML, some benefits that are seen is that the ML doesn't require any a priori or a priori assumption about the functional form. So you just let the ML see what it sees in the data, and then you can analyze it further. So what in our work, we saw some advantages and disadvantages to both. One is that ML takes a lot of resources to run still. OLS is a lot easier to run. So if there could be some a hybrid method to use both models at the same time. So you could use ML for diagnostics, and then you could use linear regression for a more physical understanding of the relationship, because ML still has that issue with it being a black box in some cases. So those hybrid models can be really helpful. But yeah, and ML, my results showed that the a priori or the starting with the functional form has a big impact on what you end up with, because any assumption that you make restricts the space within which the model can be built then. So the fewer assumptions that you make to start with, the more space the model has to come up with the most accurate result. And I think there was another question. Yeah, the model, when it starts going out of its training space, it has issues, and that is also visible when we run our model for the end of this century. So I always prefer to make sure that the space within which the model is operating, or the future data that the model is operating on, is still within the boundaries on which it was trained. So, but as climate changes, as it exceeds the boundaries that have been witnessed, the models do start making assumptions about the functional form. So they just start extrapolating what they've seen in the past and sending that functional form into the future, if that makes sense. But I'm happy to discuss this more.
No, so if I just want to know your opinion, do you think physiological models might be better for this kind of predictions rather than the statistical models?
So physiological models are great. The limitation with physiological models is that there's a disjoint between how farmers work on their field, and the spatial variation in different farmer management practices, and the other variables which we can't account for in physiological models. But at the same time, physiological models are great at coming up with a priori functional forms. So you can know, or there's a physiological basis for expecting temperature to affect crops in a certain way. So currently, I'm actually working on a project where we can actually merge physiological models with statistical models and come up with something which can include advantages of both, if it makes sense.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. If there are no questions in the meanwhile, I have two. One is that, does it allow you to differentiate between the heat impact and the temperature rise impact versus the precipitation changes impact? And I know these are two highly correlated also, but is it any way that you can show, okay, this happens because of temperature and this can happen because of precipitation changes? And the second question was around, so your irrigation one was really kind of modeling what happens when we adapt, and irrigation being an adaptation one, and you were showing that even with irrigation, assuming we can irrigate, that's a big if, but there is also a residual risk. So I thought that one of the things we had tried to do in our water chapter in which you were involved was look at these future effectiveness of adaptation. And my colleagues covered some of that through their R&D questions. So future effectiveness of adaptation at a different levels of global warming. Is that something that your work is also looking at? Are you now kind of trying to put in various adaptation measures that there can be irrigation being one, and how effective those are in reducing these climate risks? And if you can differentiate between the temperature versus the water cycle related risks.
Yeah, to answer your first question, yes, to some extent, our models can explain how different climate variables or different weather changes affect crop yields. Although they are correlated, so temperature changes are correlated with precipitation changes, we can still parse out some relationships of specific climate variables. So we can see that temperature rises for the same amount of rainfall have X amount of impact on crop yields, or if precipitation changes by X amount while temperature stays the same, that impacts crop yields in a certain way. Of course, I'm always hesitant to report these kind of results. I always try to take a more holistic picture in terms of what is the future climate, which includes changing in both temperature and precipitation, and how that will manifest itself. To your second question, yes, currently we are discussing this with a couple of collaborators. So there are different adaptation techniques that are discussed in scientific and policy circles. Irrigation is one of them. There's also changing cropping patterns, which is a bit controversial at the same time, because farmers are doing what they're doing because of certain historical circumstances. So shifting crops, or changing crops is not as easy. So these sort of adaptation changes, so it can give us a boundary space within which we can operate. So we could say that even if India were to reduce its rice production by 20% or 30% or 50%, this is how much climate will impact crop yields. So these kind of thought experiments are always useful, but they of course have to be taken within the practical realm of what can actually be done. We can't really tell farmers to stop growing something and start growing some other crop next year, because they've already invested a lot of stuff into the machinery or the knowledge that they have for growing a certain crops. There are also some other adaptation patterns which we are examining, like changing crop calendars. So as climate changes, maybe planting or harvesting 10 days before or 10 days later could have some advantages. That sort of analysis is also being done. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's, I think, a area of huge under research. We don't really know how effective different adaptation would remain. If you don't mind, Balsher, can you unshare your screen? I realize that we are recording this, and
Okay.
so yeah, I mean, your email is great, but maybe for I see there's a question by Charles, and I also see that we have some very distinguished participants today who have been listening. I can see Aisha, I can see Professor Rao, I can see Devinder. So if they have any questions, they're also most welcome to ask. Now over to Charles Waddingham. Charles, you should be able to speak.
Oh, thank you. And thank you very much for a most interesting presentation. I was just curious, given, of course, whether it's a machine learning model or some more conventional statistical analysis, that the quality of the input data is always a potential constraint. Whether there are any regional variations, you believe, in the quality of the data, or is it actually fairly uniform, so you can really rely on it in terms of revealing some of the regional differences?
Yeah, that is a great question, Charles. It's the Achilles heel of these modelers like me. the quality of data. There is some, there are like any other data sets, there are some issues with this data as well. For example, it was really funny when I plotted crop yields on a histogram and there were spikes on whole numbers. So the reported number of 1 ton per hectare is extremely high. So compared to 0.99 or 1.01. So these are, of course, reported at district level. So there are some data quality issues. In terms of spatial variation, that's a really interesting point. I haven't analyzed that. I could do that. That shouldn't be too hard. But because they are reported from different district and state governments, I expect there would be some differences. But overall, yeah, data quality is always an issue with these sort of analysis, and that does always bias the results downwards. So the sensitivity that we see from our results is probably less than the sensitivity that we actually observe in the field.
Yeah. Thanks, Balsher. Are there any other questions? I was wondering if Isha or Devinder Singh or Professor Rao would like to pitch in. Isha, especially around your recent paper that you published around, I do see you have raised your hand. Yes, so let me promote you to a panelist. I think you should be able to talk now, Isha. Are you able to? And also, I'll just note Krishna, Professor Rao. Yes. Okay. Hi, Isha.
Hi, Aditi, and thanks so much, Balsher. That was a great presentation, and thanks for prodding me to ask a question, Aditi. This is fascinating work, and Balsher, I was wondering if in your statistical model, of course, you're exploring different types of adaptation strategies in your ongoing work, and you explained one with irrigation. I was wondering if you'd also tried, for example, just separating out districts that have experienced hotter climate on average compared to other districts in the past. And if you then interacted that with all of your climatic variables, were you seeing some sort of a moderating effect as sort of an experiment to show that if you've experienced higher temperatures in the past, then you're adapting to that that temperature rise compared to other districts that might not have. And I'm wondering if that difference was palpable in some of your statistical models. And my second question was related to the machine learning versus using regression models and maybe non-linear regression models as well. And what was the margin of difference? I know you explained that, through your graphs, that really nice summary graph that you had. And I did notice that there were some big differences for certain crops, perhaps not for others. Maybe I'm mistaken. And could you give us a sense of where it mattered the most? Perhaps it was for certain crops, or perhaps it was for certain variables. Many thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hi Isha, nice to meet you. For those who don't know, I derive a lot of my work and inspiration from Isha's research, so thank you for that. In terms of some, so if I understood the first question correctly, you're wondering whether some regions which experienced hotter temperatures have adapted better, so they may be moderating the impact of climate in my model. That is an interesting point. I haven't done that analysis, but I could try that. So I could pick some regions which are more, which have seen more variation in climate, and then see how the models, what sort of climate sensitivity the models predict. And in terms of the advantages or disadvantages of ML, as I was expecting, the machine learning models are a lot more accurate in terms of predicting yields. just because of the way they are fit, they are able to pick up regional differences which we don't input into our linear regression. So in a linear regression, there are some assumptions that we make about climate yield relationships, and then we extend those to either the state or the national level. The ML is able to pick up these regional differences. And so it was more accurate in terms of predicting yields. In terms of predicting the impact of climate, there was a mixed bag of results. For some crops, we saw that the one model, the OLS model, for example, said that yields are more sensitive, while the ML said that, no, you know what, the yields are not sensitive to climate, it's mostly a regional variation. So there is, I recently published a paper on this as well. There's also a big confounding impact of climate and non-climatic factors. So if, for example, I'll try to be as quick about this. If there's a part of India which is historically hot, for example, Rajasthan, and if there's a part of India which is less hot, the difference in crop yields between the two, the model could sometimes attribute it to geography, even though those differences may be coming from climate as well, if I'm not being too confusing about it. But I don't know if it answers your question, that sometimes the ML does outperform linear regression in terms of predicting which crops are more sensitive, but sometimes it just says that crop yields are not as sensitive as the predictions from a linear regression.
Many thanks, Balsher. Could I just to follow up on that? I guess that brings an interesting point in the sense that, you know, the ML clearly is very good at prediction, but I wonder if the statistical models are perhaps better at telling you how much of that variable of interest, so is, you know, the precipitation or that sub-seasonal variable that you were looking at, or it was the degree days above X, you know, degrees, to really identify the impact of those specific variables. Perhaps the regression model does a better job to explain the effect of those variables, but the ML does a very good job of prediction, of course. I wonder that's perhaps where, you know, there's a discrepancy in the final climate change impact that you're finally seeing playing out.
Yeah, exactly. That we observed that as well. So we are able to make partial dependence plots from either models, but of course, at the end of the day, ML is still a black box comparatively a black box compared to linear regression, where we can actually get the exact functional forms that the model is outputting. Yeah, but I'd say that I would want to use ML for so there's prediction and then there's diagnosis. So ML for diagnosis and maybe linear regression for prediction, especially when data starts getting outside the historically observed data space.
Right. Thanks. I'm also conscious that we are at the end of our time. So thank you for this really good questions and answers. Now there's Professor Krishna Achyut Rao, if you would like to come in briefly.
Thanks, Balsher, for a nice talk. Quick question. Does your model of regression or AIML also include the effects of CO2 fertilization? Is that one of your covariates?
Hi, Krishna. No, I did not have CO2 fertilization in my model. That was one shortcoming or one limitation of our analysis. Although technically CO2 fertilization does get included in the model because there's a time variable, and CO2 changes are extremely, they have a strong time signal in them. So they are rising predictably over time. But I did not have actual CO2 fertilization data in my models.
Right, because you know, the process-based models can actually, well, they've been used to separate out the effects of CO2 fertilization versus other fertilizer use and and insecticides and pesticides and
Yeah.
all of that. So you can actually separate out the effects of crop management versus things that are climate related, things that are CO2, which impact physiologically. So, so is there any scope for getting that level of granularity in separating out these multiple effects with these statistical or AI/ML model?
Yeah, if so, these statistical models, they can be used with for that sort of analysis as well. So if I have fertilizer data over time and space, I could include that in my model. If I have CO2 data, for example, I believe Professor Schlenker, Wolfram Schlenker, has done some work on this CO2 fertilization using statistical models. I'm not sure if that work has been published yet, but I did not include that, but it can be done. And in fact, I do understand that there are some distinct advantages to physiology-based physiological models like APSIM or DSAT. And I'm actually in discussions with a collaborator, with a potential collaborator, if we can build a model which can include output from both statistical and physiological models, because there are some. At the end of the day, I'm just using historical data to understand something that has a physiological basis without actually using those physiological relationships. So there's an indirect way of approaching it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Balsher. We are at the end of this seminar, and yeah, I think it was fascinating and very useful for the kind of work we all do. Especially, I like the policy implications and how this can be used for practical things in the short term as well as in the long term. We will hopefully post the video of this on our website soon. And thank you to everybody for attending. Next month, we would have our next seminar in the third seminar in the ECR series, and that will focus on coal transitions in India, energy transitions with respect to coal, and speaker will be Dr. Sandeep Pai. So yeah, stay tuned, and thank you everybody. Have a great day and great night wherever you are. Thank you so much. Bye. Thanks, Balsher.
Thank you, Aditi. Bye.
Yeah, bye.